Well, well, well. Here you are Monday, watching a video of me, watching a video of me. And what we were doing in this past video, this was the last in our Know the Node series video, where we took the tile generators and broke them all down, saw what all their instance parameters did, and I just explained what all those settings do and how you should be using a tile generator and gave some examples of how that works. In the intro, this intro, and the intro to that video, I said this. All of these guys make extensive use of tile generators, right? And that's not the full truth. I'm doing a little bit of a lie there. All those cool materials you saw that I think all look really interesting, those were using tile generation, but they were very rarely using a tile generator. They were mostly using tile samplers. They're kind of like the super powered older brother to the tile generator. They can do a lot of things that the tile generators can't. You can sort of think about it this way, I guess. Like, yeah, there's a lot of things that the tile sampler can do that the tile generator cannot. And there's very few things that the tile generator can do that the tile sampler can't. It's much more expensive to use, but oftentimes you're happy to pay that expense just to get the added functionality. Even the things that the tile generator can do that the tile sampler can't, there are workarounds for, which we will go over later in this video. There's a couple things that are nice, kind of quality of life things the tile generator does that the tile sampler can't. We're going to find fixes for those, like kind of interesting workarounds. The big difference between the two is the tile generator has a lot of attributes like the scale random, for instance. There's things like color random, rotation random, all those things. The big difference in the sampler is that we can use textures to drive those effects as well. So we could plug in something like a linear gradient into the scale map input. And now instead of just having scale random like we do on the generator, we also can change the scale map multiplier to scale these textures differently based on the incoming input texture. That's the big difference. What we're going to do today is go through this entire thing, the entire tile sampler node, going through every single attribute, every single thing in the instance parameters and showing what they do. And at the end of it, we're going to be talking a lot about the input textures and some fun stuff with vector maps, which is really important to understand on the tile sampler. I'm sure we'll do a video at some point that's a real deep dive into the vector stuff, but we'll need a little bit of it today. And at the end, once we've gone through and like decided how they all work, the way I like to teach stuff is to show you just like one by one how those things work. And then we're going to put them all together to actually make something. So at the end of the day, we're going to make this guy, which we built in this video. And it just ties a bunch. I think it uses basically every single mask map input at some point, just so you can see like a practical example of where you might want to use one or the other. And this is just one example of what it can do. These can do a ton. There's sort of unlimited uses for these. It is likely you will use a tile sampler in every graph you make. If I had to guess, they're probably in 90% of mine plus, and that's fairly normal, I think. People like this node, and it's really, really important to use. If you like the video, please remember to like the video. Subscribe if you haven't subscribed. Hit the bell, all that fun stuff. As well as you'd like, this is the result. This video is the result of a vote on Patreon. So on the Patreon, I normally put up a vote for stuff I'd like to cover next, and then people vote on what they want the most. And this was actually wanted more than a lot of the other stuff, which I thought was strange personally, because I thought the other stuff was more interesting. But I think there's like an appetite to have these kind of videos made, so that's great. If you'd like to be part of those votes or to see content before it comes out, heading over to the Patreon to support me there would be greatly appreciated. It really helps the channel, allows me to, justify the time to sit and make all these really long stuff. On the Patreon, there's a ton of extra videos for exclusive stuff of, big walkthroughs of individual materials that are, 10 hours long, 8 hours long tutorials. So if you're interested in those, you can hop over there. If not, like just liking the video is really helpful. I appreciate it. But with all that kind of standard YouTube guy stuff out of the way, let's get on to the actual video. Let's hop in and talk tile samplers. Okay, so let's get going on these. So I have a couple example graphs in here, just some shapes that we can use to show off all the different settings. We're going to later apply most of these to an actual finished graph so you can see how they're applied. But this will be helpful for just exploring the different ways in which this node can work. So I had this graph. We don't really need these other versions for now, but this graph just puts out a pebble, which we're going to use later. It's a pretty simple graph that just creates these little pebbles that are really helpful for explaining what a lot of stuff on here does. I have an arrow node. I actually grabbed this from, it's somewhere in Designer. I forget what tool uses it. I could find that later. And then this footprint, which we also used in the tile generator video to explain some of the size mode stuff, which we'll use again. And we're just going to do a lot of comparison between these two. You're going to tell right away this one's more expensive. And, you know, these numbers might be different for you just because it's when it happened to compile. But in general, you can expect the tile sampler to be much more expensive. And it looks a lot more complicated. It's not that bad, actually. There's actually probably less. I think there's less settings on the tile sampler than there are on the tile generator. But you do have a lot more options, weirdly. So let's go through this. First of all, it's instance parameters, and then we'll talk about all of the image inputs, because these are really what you're here for. If you're looking at a tile sampler as opposed to a tile generator, what you're often paying for is the ability to control these parameters via a texture, which we'll get into. So there's some kind of, you know, kind of superficial differences between the two. Tile generator starts with 10 by 10. Tile sampler starts with 16 by 16. And tile sampler starts with just squares that are scaled down to 0.8 so that they don't touch. The tile generator is set to bricks instead of squares, and they're set to scale 1 instead of 0.8. Right? So there is some subtle differences. It doesn't really matter. You're never really going to use the default settings anyway, so it's not really a big deal. Going through here, this stuff is exactly the same, right? X amount, Y amount, same thing. This is important in some cases. So what this does is if you have the tile sampler, and the tile generator also does this. If you have either of these nodes, and you for some reason have a power of 2 texture, or not non-power of 2, but a non-square texture. So if you're making maybe a trim sheet, you want some texture that's twice as wide as it is tall. So if we go down, or we go up on this node to its output size and turn the height down, you'll see that we actually get twice as many tiles now in width than we do in height. So this used to be 10 by 10. We can make this really simple and have less. So if we have 4 by 4, you can see we have 8 by 4 because we're making the texture twice as wide as it is tall. If you click this button, it ignores that. So it doesn't expand the amount of tiles to compensate for the fact that the texture is no longer a uniform size that is wider than it is tall or taller than it is wide. So kind of a niche thing. If you're working on trim sheets, it's really important, but generally you don't see it too much. The pattern rollout is largely the same. There's not a ton that's different about this. One crucial difference, which we'll get to. So you can pick your patterns here exactly the same. You know, these are fine. These are all just kind of the primitive shapes that you would find on a shape node when you're going through the drop down here, just looking at stuff you want to put out. You're often plugging in your own custom thing, in which case, instead of picking a shape here, you're picking image input, which will go black because you haven't plugged anything in. But sometimes you do use this, and it's totally fine. We may do a little bit of it later. You'll also notice that some of these, so for example, capsule will have this. It has this pattern-specific slider. Not all the shapes do. And that's just because if you go to the shape node and go to the pattern-specific, or sorry, the capsule, it has a pattern specific. And for this, they all do different things that are kind of, it's like a unique ability that that pattern has. If you move the pattern specific, you get to stretch that capsule out, right? It creates a capsule, I guess, like a pill shape. This would be the same thing here. You create that pill shape. You do have that pattern specific random. And what this does is just apply that random quality, or apply that specific quality rather, randomly to all the tiles. Right, so there's some niche uses for this. I don't use it a ton, but it can definitely come up. And if it's easy enough, you may as well do it. But like I said, often you're just using image input, pattern input, and you're plugging something in. We plug these arrows in or whatever. So that's very similar. The pattern input number is very similar as well. If you plug this, if you increase this number, you'll see we add a new input, a new slot to be able to add another input. And in this case, we don't have anything plugged in, so it goes to black. So something to keep in mind, right? If you don't have anything plugged in, you're actually taking away essentially half of them, because right now it's a coin flip whether a given pattern should be pattern 1 or pattern 2, which is a black square right now. It's nothing. So 50% chance, 50% chance, 50% chance, 50% chance, so on and so forth. So it just takes away half of them, which will be useful in a second. But for now, what we'll do is duplicate this and find another rock we like. That one's a little similar. Sure. If we plug this in, all those black squares will be filled up with that second rock. And I'm just going to turn down the number of patterns here, just so that they're a bit bigger, and scale them up a bit. So you can see now we're going, you have a 50% chance of being either pattern 1 or pattern 2. So you get more variety out of this, essentially. This is exactly the same as the tile generator. One thing that's worth knowing about this is this pattern input distribution is really important. So on a random mode, which is the default, it's just going to pick like I said, it's a coin flip, right? You're playing the slot machine. It's going to be 50%. Well, it's very good odds, I guess, but you're either going to be pattern 1, pattern 2. If you want, you can switch this to pattern number. And now what it's going to do is, depending on the ID, basically the number really, the index, right? Like what number pattern this is, it's going to alternate, essentially, right? So it's going, hey, on shape 1, you'll be pattern 1. On shape 2, you'll be pattern 2. And then on shape 3, you'll be back to pattern 1. Shape 4, you'll be back to pattern 2. And it just alternates all the way through the texture. So that's another thing. It's a weird, subtle difference to the tile generator. The tile generator, for whatever reason, or the tile sampler rather, counts its patterns in a slightly different way. So if you go to the tile generator and go to, just as a second, go down to the luminance by number, it just shades these squares different grayscale values based on their ID, essentially. So this is the first tile, and then it goes to second, then third, then fourth, and you see they're gradually getting brighter. Eventually down here, you have tile 10, and then you go to tile 11, tile 12, tile 13. So it scans kind of through the texture up and down. The tile sampler is different. If you go down to that same slider on the tile sampler, so we change the color parameterization to pattern index, and we'll talk about all this stuff when we get down there, and turn this up, it's different, right? It starts at 0 and goes to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, all the way to 16, and then 17. So it reads much more like you would if you're just reading a book, or at least in English if you're reading, right? You go left to right, up and down. Whereas the tile generator does not. It goes up and down, left to right. So just a slight difference to be aware of. But essentially, this is pattern 1, pattern 2, pattern 3, pattern 4, pattern 5, all the way, just like you're reading a book. And that's why it's going, put this one, then this one, then this one, then this one, over and over. And you can have a third. You can have up to 6. So you can get a different rock. Be like this shape too. We can go up to pattern input again. And you'll see that now we go 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Right? So it just changes the way that they're distributed. Instead of them being random, basically like a 33% chance of any of these being the one that shows up. Now, instead of that, it's just going in order. You can also put in a distribution map. So this is a big part of the tile sampler we were mentioning in the intro is the fact that basically the main difference is that all of these, not all, but a lot of these sliders are controllable via texture. And this is the first one. So we can use a we don't have anything plugged in, so it's not working. But let's go down to 2 patterns for a second. So random, right? The rocks are randomly assigned. Pattern number, they're assigned based on the number they are on the pattern, what their ID is, essentially. Or you can do by distribution map. Now, this doesn't do anything by default, and that's just because we haven't plugged anything in to the pattern distribution map. But what you'll see, this is a good way of seeing how any of these work, and we'll do it a lot, is to just plug in our handy dandy gradient. We'll be using this all over the place just to test these. So we plug this in. Now you see something interesting. Where it's dark in the pattern distribution map, it's picking pattern 1. And where it's bright in the pattern distribution map, it's picking pattern 2. So you can actually use a texture to say where each one should go. And it's just a sensitivity to grayscale values. So for example, we can go up to 4, and let's put in a pebble, a arrow, a footprint, and then a star, for example. So you can see along the gradient, we swap from one pattern to the next. We start with pebbles, which makes sense. And then we go to arrows, which is our pattern 2. Then we go to footprints, and then we go to stars finally. And the stars are big enough that they're wrapping around to the bottom as well. So if we scale everything down, right? A bit more clear. So this can be really helpful. It's also, you can do stuff like this, right? We can put our, we're going to do 2 by 2 on a tile generator, and I'm going to go to luminance by number and turn this to a square just so we don't have that bevel between stuff. And here's just a very different distribution map. Now we're going to kind of put them in their own quadrants, right? So you're actually able to control where those patterns go. I just want to level this a bit more. You can control where stuff goes using this pattern and leveling it. You can do it with the gradient too. Oh, didn't plug this in. You can bias it more towards one or the other. So you want a lot more stars, less of everything else, a lot more bricks, less of everything else. So you have a lot of control over where stuff goes. So this is occasionally useful, right? There's plenty of cases I found where it makes sense, but those are your options. And it's the first example of having a map control a slider instead of having it just be some random number, essentially, or some predetermined value. You're able to control it independently in different spots of the sheet using a texture. But for now, we'll leave this on pattern number. We're not that worried about that. And we're just going to go down to 1 rock again for now. We'll want more later, but we'll just go down to pattern 1 and we can unplug this. So that's that. The bilinear and the image filtering here, this just changes the ways that the texture, because this texture is being scaled and shrank and put all over the place. And this is just changing the way that filtering is done. So seeing something like nearest, it's a point filter, so it's really, really sharp. Bilinear and mipmaps applies some form of image filtering. So bilinear plus mipmaps, just bilinear. You will occasionally need this. In fact, in the video we made on common artifacts in Substance Designer, we run into an issue where this fixes things. So that's a good video to check out for this one. It's sort of not in the scope of this video. It doesn't make a ton of sense to go through, but these are definitely useful in certain niche cases. Okay, rotation, symmetry, random. Let's get moving through these. So rotation random just applies a random rotation, a random 90-degree rotation to the image inputs. So if we use a arrow, we scale this down. These arrows are just rotating 90 degrees in some random direction. So they're either going 90 or 180 or 270 or 0 or 1, right? So they can only turn in 90-degree increments, and they do so randomly. So this can be useful, like on our Pebbles, this makes a lot of sense because it just gets you some extra variety, potentially, right? It's not a bad deal. The symmetry random does much the same. So if we plug the footprint in, symmetry random just applies random mirrors to this. So sometimes the footprint will be mirrored vertically across its x-axis. Sometimes it'll be mirrored vertically across its v-axis or its y-axis, right? You can also say, hey, I only want you to be able to be mirrored horizontally. So this allows us, in the case of the foot, the boot, for example, if we don't have this on, we have all left feet or all right feet, I guess, right? If we turn this on, some are right, some are left. So this would be a useful, very useful thing with the boot as an example, because you could just the same have a version of the boot that is flipped horizontally, go to your pattern input and make this 2 so that you don't have just one pattern, you have a second one, and then you don't need the symmetry random. Some will be right, some will be left, but you can just skip that entirely and use the symmetry random. Again, switching it to only horizontal. You can switch it to only vertical too. And this will only apply vertical transformations, vertical mirrors. So these are essentially a way of getting more variety out of the things you make. So if I'm putting Pebbles out here, which we'll do later, I'm going to crank both of these to full because it just gets more use out of it. If you've ever built something, you're modeling and you have a brick wall to make and you're making all these different bricks, like you're used to like rotating some, mirroring some so that you get more variety out of less stuff you have to make. This is very much the same. So going into size, these size modes are fairly important to understand. So On the normal mode, which is the default on the tile sampler, which is helpful. I don't like that on the tile generator. The default size mode is interstice, which is not my favorite. So size mode, which is the default, I think this is very self-explanatory. You can control the size X, right? So how big they are horizontally, size Y, how big they are vertically. And then you have randoms for those two. So you can have some random amount of size difference in X, some random amount of size difference in Y. It's notable that the size random in X, it can never make the shape bigger than it is. It can only make it smaller in X, right? So it doesn't say, hey, become some different value all the way to, you know, half as small as you are or 1.5 times bigger than you are. It only goes down. So often what you're doing is turning on some size X random and then increasing the size X so that they can be wider or the original size or smaller. That's very common. And then obviously you can do the exact same thing with Y. You can have random size Y and the same thing. You would probably want to put this up to get more randomness. So they can be taller or shorter, not just shorter. But these work, you know, exactly as you'd expect. And these are the same, which we'll get to in a minute. The other size modes, a lot of them are really useful. The one I don't find useful, and you'll really never catch me using unless I'm just being sloppy, is interstice, which is missing on the tile sampler. We talked about this in our tile generator node. What this does is you change the size of the spaces between the tiles. So we're making the gap between them in X larger, or the gap between them in Y larger, which I don't like thinking about. I want to move this slider up and have the tile get bigger. I don't want to have to move this slider up and have the shape get smaller. Feels bad. So I don't do that. You have to kind of like, you know, 5-head that one. I don't want to have to think that hard. This is much simpler. Size goes down, shape goes down. Simpler. These are universal scales. So this scale will just scale the pattern uniformly. Like each pattern will receive this same kind of scale multiple. You can also add some scale random. So this just applies some random scale to the shapes. But then we get to our fun stuff that's tile sampler specific. These three are really, really cool. So again, you're always going to see this map multiplier, right? This is just like our distribution map. This type of thing is going to come up a lot. This is like really common on the sampler. And all that means is it's telling you, hey, you can plug something in to the scale map input and do something fun with it. So what we could do, we're going to use our handy gradient. This is just a really good way of previewing how these work. If we plug this into scale map, it doesn't do anything. None of these things will do anything if you just plug something in. You have to change their slider. But if we change the scale map multiplier, you'll see that in the dark areas of the texture, if a pattern shows up in a dark pixel, it's going to get darker, or it's going to get smaller rather. And the closer you are to white, the more you just don't get changed at all. You don't scale down. So this is really nice because you can make different areas of the texture have smaller or larger pebbles. So you use the arrow as an input, we use the footprint. But these are very much like off or on. Right? Not many of them happen to fall in the white here. It's notable that if we do this, right, and I subtract from the boot, this is where the little pebbles are. We're never going to see them over top of the boot. Right? Because these pebbles never get a white value from where the boot is. The ones that did, they become much larger. So this is very useful. You use this all the time. You'll find there's a lot of instances where you're going to want shapes to get bigger in a certain area and smaller in a certain area, which we'll get to when we do our big example later. But that's how this works. And you can plug whatever you want into here. And in fact, later we're going to chain multiple of these together to do some really cool effects. So this is a bit more subtle, but we can turn its map multiplier up. And that's really cool, right? So we get some bigger ones in the white areas here and some smaller ones in the black areas here. Really, really neat. You can also go down to that same slider here, you have the scale map parametrization effect. So this allows you to have the scale map only affect a certain size, either X or Y. So if we do it with X, it's only going to change their size like in X as opposed to Y, or just their size in Y, or both combined, which is more often I use this, but later on you're going to see we actually do the reverse of this. We're going to need to use just one of them when we do our big example graph. But that's how this works. You're able to just pick whether to affect both or just one or the other. The scale vector map multiplier, I don't use a ton. In fact, basically never. We're going to actually loop back to this one after we do the other vector map inputs. I basically don't find a use for this one, essentially, but we can go into it later. For now, let's go to the position and all that fun stuff. So position, there's a position random here. This puts a random position adjustment, so some kind of random offset, both horizontally and vertically, importantly, for the patterns. So here's our first, you're going to use this all the time to scatter stuff around in a more natural feeling way. Here is kind of the first disadvantage to the tile sampler, which we can fix and we will fix later. In the tile generator, but not the sampler, right? We talked about this in the tile generator video, actually. There is a downside here. In the tile generator, when you go to that same position rollout here, you can control the X position random and the Y position random independently, which you cannot do on the tile sampler. But we will trick it. There's a couple things on the tile generator you can do that you can't on the tile sampler. We're going to go back and figure out a kind of a trick to fix those things. But by default, you don't have that ability. You just have to deal with the fact that it will be X and Y. But you'll be using this often, all the time. Offsets, this would work exactly like you think. This just applies an offset in this case to every other row. That's what this horizontal quincux means, right? So every other row will get some, if we put it on 0.5, we're getting our brick offsets, right? So brick 1, brick 2, brick 3, like they have them. If we had switched this to square and we scale it down a bit or use pyramids, sure. These rows are offset from this row. This row is the same as this one, so on and so forth. You can switch the offset type to be vertical quincux, right? So now the offset happens vertically instead of horizontally. So it's by column, right? This column doesn't move, this column moves. This column doesn't move, this column moves. Opposed to this one, which is this row doesn't move, this row moves. You can also do horizontal global, which just applies an offset horizontally that gets stronger the further down you go in row. And if you put this at 0.5, it actually will look exactly the same as had you had a horizontal quincux, right? They don't look any different. But you can choose basically the method here that you're going to use to offset the textures. You can also switch to vertical global, right? So the further you go in column number, the further that offset will apply, or the stronger the offset will be. I'm often just using I'm often using horizontal global because this is more what I expect from how a tile generator works. But often quincux horizontal is useful as well. You also have global offsets. This is useful occasionally. This just moves the every tile, some value along X or some value along Y. So those are fairly interesting. You'll use a lot of them. I'm going to switch back to our Pebbles for a second. This is where we get into the really fun stuff. So displacement map intensity. This is really cool. So we need a displacement map. And obviously we don't have anything plugged in, so this doesn't do anything. But these two attributes, properties, I guess, the displacement map intensity and the displacement map angle work together. So what this does is we're going to plug in a gradient again. This works a lot like a directional warp in a sense. So we pick which angle we want the direction that we want these patterns to move in. So we'll say, hey, go all the way to the left, this way. The displacement map intensity scales the strength of the effect. And you can see, because our displacement map input is black at the bottom, white at the top, the patterns at the top of the sheet are moving much more than the patterns at the bottom of the sheet. So the input intensity basically works, or the input texture acts as basically a mask for how strong that displacement effect should be. And then you're just picking which direction they should go in on that displacement angle. Right now I'm going to squash them all down into the bottom, for instance. Right, because they're moving down now because we've made the angle go down. And the ones at the top are moving a lot more than the ones at the bottom. So you can do some kind of neat stuff with this. It's sort of fun. There's some, obviously with different shapes in here, this gets, if you have slightly more interesting noises, this can get really cool. I don't use this one as much. Very infrequently will I use this. It can do some neat stuff. But what it's really good for, basically anything we would want it to do, the vector map displacement works better. A lot better. So this is fine. You will find uses for it. But we should talk about the vector displacement. So there's one input for here that applies a vector map. So it's the only color input. You will often be plugging a normal map into this. But the way this works is we can supply, instead of using this as an intensity and this is our angle, we're going to instead use this as our intensity, and we're going to supply the angle for the vector map using an actual vector map, like using a texture. So as an example, you're often using a normal map here. So I'm going to do this first, and then we're going to go back and explain what's going on here. We're going to eventually do a whole video on vectors in Designer. If you're using like vector morph or vector warp or the vector map input, they all rely on a very similar piece of knowledge. So if I plug that in, this is much more cool. So you go down to this, turn this up. This is really fun. So all the rocks are moving away from the center of this image, because this is really just supplying a bunch of different directions on where you should go. So depending on where these patterns were along the initial vector map. So if we go up to this, depending on where these are along the normal map, they're going to have a different direction to go in. And this is why you're often using a normal map, because it's often much more intuitive to get the thing you're looking to get done. They just move away from it, from the white area of the normal map and towards the black area of the height map, I guess, that's being turned into a normal. Very fun. It does a lot more cool stuff. Like you could invert this too, if you wanted. And now they'll move the opposite direction, right? They're going to kind of collapse towards the middle, which is really neat. To understand what's actually going on here, instead of using a normal map, let's just build the vector map ourselves. So I'm going to get an RGBA merge node and plug that in. And I'm going to get 2 uniform grayscale nodes. It is worth making the bit depth of these. It's fine if it's just a uniform color, but once we get into textures, we'll need to put that up. But you'll see what I mean. If we plug in black into the red and black into the green, we've made, it's a black texture. The vector map only cares about what's in the red and green of the texture, because our UV sheet, right, our texture sheet only really has 2 dimensions, the X or the U value and the V or the Y value, right? X and Y. There's only 2 possible axes, X and Y. So that's what red and green are. The red is the X-axis, the green is the Y-axis. And what we're essentially doing is supplying a direction. So if we say, hey, I want you to go 0 along X and 0 along Y, that's up here. So you can think about your texture here as a grid where 0, 0 is up here in the top left corner and 1, 1 is in the bottom right corner. So this is 0 horizontal, 0 vertical. This is 1 horizontal, 1 vertical. The vertical is flipped in Designer, right? You would think that this would be the top, like if you were in Maya. This is the top. That's the bottom. And then in the middle, you have 0.5, 0.5. Over here, you have 1 horizontal, 0 vertical. Over here, you have 0 horizontal, 1 vertical. So those are basically, you can think about those as areas we're pointing to. And right now, because we're plugging in 0, 0, we're pointing to the top left where 0, 0 is. If we turn the vector map input up, you'll see that everything is going to move towards the top left. Really cool. If we make these both white, so 1, 1, we're now pointing to the bottom right corner where 1, 1 is. So they're going to move that direction towards the bottom right corner. So you can really control where these go independently by doing different things in the different channels. And this is fairly common. You will do this. So you could do things like this helps us fix, for example, our lack of having a position X and a position Y difference. Remember that on the tile generator, we can control the position random in X and the position random in Y independently. But on the tile sampler, we were stuck with just controlling both at once. But we can use this vector map to actually fix that, which is really, really cool. Because what we want, if we have these on white and white, right, 1 and 1, and we move these, that's on our rotation, which we'll get to later, we're moving these towards the bottom right. So what if we just wanted them to move horizontally? Right? Either horizontally backwards or horizontally forwards. Right? Vertically, we don't want them to move at all. So we can set this to 0.5. So you'll see now when we move these, they're only moving left and right. Because 1 vertical is down here, 0 vertical is up here, 0.5 vertical is here. So right now they're being told, I don't want to move up or down. I only want to move to the right when we have a white value here. If we had a black value, they would move to the left, to the other direction. So we go down to the vector map and turn it up. If we make this black, it'll move the other direction towards the left. If we make it white, it would move the other direction towards the right. But what if we gave this a random white or black value? So if we just plugged in like our Gaussian noise, for example, here, I'll just auto level it. Now what we've done is certain areas of this texture, if a pattern's over here, it's going to move white, so it's going to move towards the positive X. And if it's over here, where it's black, it's going to move towards negative X. And over here, if it happens to get exact middle gray, it's not going to do either. And remember, vertical is not moving at all. And this effectively creates that position random, being able to control in only one axis. Because some move to the left, some move to the right. So here we go. We can already take care of one of the disadvantages of the tile sampler. It's a little bit more involved, I suppose, but it's not that hard. And if you wanted to switch these so that the position offset was vertical instead of horizontal, all you really have to do is switch these inputs so that the noise is now in the vertical channel and the flat one is in the horizontal channel. So you can just grab both of these and hit the X key to swap them. And now the offset is vertical. So you can do really fun stuff in here. You could have, so let's not move it vertical, but then let's make a gradient like this in the red channel. So what this is going to do is patterns that show up on this side of the texture are going to move more towards that side, and patterns that are on this side are going to move towards the other side. So this allows us to like pull our texture apart. So we'll go down to the vector map. There's tiling, so you're seeing them wrap around, but this is really neat. They move away from the middle towards the sides. If we didn't want that tiling to be so annoying, we could turn the tiling mode off for a second and you'll see this work a lot better, right? We pull the texture apart. Whereas if we flipped this gradient, instead of being pulled apart, they'll squeeze towards the middle. Like this. And if you can apply levels to this, you can do all sorts of fun stuff here to manipulate that direction that you should move in. Right? Balance them all towards one side, balance them all towards the other. You can do really, really cool stuff with this. So sometimes you will actually be building your vector map custom because you need it to do something really specific. But like I mentioned, a lot of the times what you're doing is just making a normal map, because that is essentially doing that. If we look at our normal map here, we look at just the red axis. So I'm just tapping R to look at the red channel. Anywhere there's white in the normal map, it'll move to the positive direction. Anywhere there's black in the normal map, it'll move towards the negative X. And then in the green channel of the normal map, where there's white, it'll move positive. Where it's black, it'll move negative. So you're often using a normal map here. This just moves them along the normal. Very, very cool. So when we go to make our rock graph example, you'll see why this is really important. It can do like really, really cool stuff. So we'll leave the vector map for now, and we'll talk about rotations. And I'm just going to clear up some of these. And let's go through rotations. So we'll go here. Rotation, this just applies a global rotation to all of them. So it's sort of like the scale multiplier, where we're just making them all bigger or all smaller. This just rotates them all. Rotation random applies some sort of random rotation. So they can be either rotated to 0 or 1 or anywhere in between 0 and 1. Rotation map multiplier allows us to apply that rotation value at different extents depending on where they are on the rotation map. Right? So again, we're into one of our things that is like special about the tile sampler that the tile generator cannot do. So if we plug in, for instance, the grayscale, the gradient here, and we turn the rotation multiplier up, the white areas of this texture are going to rotate a lot more. And the black areas of the texture don't rotate at all, or very little, because it's not pure black down here. The center of that pattern would be like, I don't know, 0 point, you know, it's quite dark, but not black. So it's rotating a little bit, but very, very little. So this is really neat because you'll be able to make these arrows, in this case, but they can be anything, right? Later on, we're going to do it with some grass blades. And in fact, in an earlier, in a Patreon review video, we use this to help the grass blades feel a lot more flowy. We'll do that later. So this allows you to apply that rotation based on a texture. So you can have different amounts in different areas. It's very, very fun. This is useful for a lot of stuff when you just want to have things flow, essentially, because with this, depending on how frequent this texture is, like if we just used white noise, for instance, this would be no different really than using rotation random, right? This is no different than just doing this, because each arrow in this case is showing up over top of some random value. So some will be rotated a lot, some will be rotated not at all, and they're very different in every pixel. But if you apply a noise that's a lot less frequent, a lot slower, like a Gaussian noise, which you already have here, because the values on the Gaussian noise kind of gradually change, right? From this bright value to this dark value really slowly, The nodes are going to be, the arrows rather, are going to be rotated very similar directions to their neighbors. Right, so it's not like we have a huge jump where this is rotated this way and then this one is rotated like 180 degrees the other way. It's a lot more subtle. And the more we have of these, the more subtle it is. You can see kind of a slow rotation from one arrow to the next. And that's just dependent on this texture. Right, the more spiky this texture is, the less that will be helpful. They can be very different right next to each other. These are 180 degrees apart from each other. But in the Gaussian noise, they're very subtly different. So this is fun for like grass blades, which we did in the Patreon video. But it's useful for all sorts of stuff where you want a shape to have a very similar rotation value to its neighbor, but slightly different. So you will use this, and we're going to do it later. What's probably more interesting is our vector map multiplier. So instead, this one just applies an intensity of rotation, the rotation map multiplier, based on how bright the value is. If we use the vector map multiplier, it's going to rotate them. It's going to get the angle they should go in from that vector. So in the same way that when we were using the displacement map, the vector displacement, it was sampling that normal map and saying, hey, which direction should I move in? This is the same thing, except it's going to ask the normal map or the vector map, which direction should I face in? So you will often be plugging a normal map into this, but just so we have the exact same example, if we have an RGBA merge and we make two black values, one plugged into red, one plugged into green, and we plug that into the vector map multiplier, we're going to turn that rotation map multiplier off. And look what happens when we turn on the vector map multiplier. They all point to 0, 0 up in the top left corner because we plugged in 0 red, right? 0 horizontal, 0 vertical. So they point up there. If we went 0, 1, they would point towards 0, 1, which is in the bottom left because it's 0 horizontal, 0 vertical, or sorry, 1 vertical. If we flip these, they're going to point into the top right corner because that's 1 horizontal, 0 vertical. And then if we make them both white, they'll point to the bottom right where it's 1, 1, 1 horizontal, 1 vertical. So you can make these point in specific directions, just, building your vector map the way you want it to. So again, we could have like a gradient plugged in for red, and we'll plug in 0.5 for vertical. So it doesn't point in any, it's going to point just left and right vertically, but it's going to sometimes point left horizontally and sometimes point right horizontally, right? So right down the middle, basically, the bright values are pointing towards positive, the dark values are pointing towards the negative side. And then these ones are like, happen to be like right on not quite middle gray. So they get a slightly different, they're not pointing in either direction. So you can build your own vector map for doing very specific things, which can be important. A lot of the times, again, you're making a normal map. So in this case, anywhere you have a flat normal, you have 0.5 gray, 0.5 green, 0.5 red, 0.5 green. They're just going to point up here. But everything else that has like normal information here, they're all oriented towards the center of this shape along the vector map. So this is going to be useful for sure for all sorts of stuff, because you're going to be able to make stuff fan away from their original direction, which can be really, really useful. So I use this one probably more than the rotation map. Again, it's really kind of specific use cases where you're going to pick between one or the other, but it is really, really helpful. You'll use this a lot. But for now, we'll turn this off and we'll go down to the color stuff. And then we're going to put them all together shortly to make a bunch of cool things using this rock texture. So let's go to color. Here, we have our mask map threshold. So we'll talk about that in a second. The mask random is just going to, this is very much like the tau generator randomness. This is just going to say, hey, you have like a 50, put on 0.5, a 50% chance of either showing up or not, basically. So half of them are gone. About, right? Like statistically, you should be very close. The more of these you have, the closer you will be to having exactly 50% dropout. If you have very few of these, right? If you go down to like 2 by 2, you know, it's 5 coin flips in a row. So the chances of us getting 4 tails is like not extraordinary. It could absolutely happen, right? If we put it on 25% of them should be gone. We have half gone. So the number is less reliable if we have less stuff to begin with, because we're flipping less quarters. If you flip 4 quarters in a row, you could get 4 heads fairly easily, or 4 tails, right? But if you have to flip, you know, 100 quarters, so we go 10 by 10, you're going to get much closer to 50 heads and 50 tails. And if you have to go, or sorry, you're going to get much closer to 50% heads, 50% tails. And if we go even higher, right, like to 40 and 40, you're going to get even closer. That you should have very close to half of one, half of the other. So that just allows you to mask out a certain amount of these, which you'll use a lot as well. There's nothing wrong with this mask random. Makes sense. The mask map threshold will allow you to do this based on a texture. So you plug the mask map input, we'll plug in a gradient again. Again, it's whenever you're trying to, if you're ever trying to study the way one of these mask map inputs works, plugging in a gradient and moving the slider is a really good way to do it, because it can show you, hey, what is happening on the brighter areas? What is happening in the darker areas? Which is really helpful, right? So it's worth doing. So what this does is culls them out based on the texture, right? So this will allow you to make the patterns go away in the dark areas and stay in the bright areas. So this will allow you to essentially mask them out in certain spots, which is really helpful. So you will often use this to turn them off, the patterns off. If you have like pebbles and you want them to only be in the small kind of cracks, you can plug the crack mask into mask map, and then the pebbles will only show up in the cracks. Right? We did a Patreon video recently on building a big pattern floor, and we wanted little pebbles in the broken areas, and we used this to achieve that. You will often use the mask map threshold, so let's plug in something a bit more interesting like our Gaussian noise for a second. And we'll zoom this out. So imagine you have like kind of a rocky field here. This is more interesting. You will probably use the mask map threshold, but also stack a little bit of random on it to get more of a natural feeling. You'll use both of these for sure. And you can invert the mask too. So here you can swap, hey, show up in the white, or hey, show up in the black, right? You can change which one you want. So that's the main color stuff. Down here, you have actually the things that change like the actual luminance, right? You're not masking the patterns. So this is just the blend mode. You can switch which blend occurs if these patterns happen to overlap. So if I scale these up a bunch so that they actually overlap, by default, the tile sampler uses a max blending mode, which in my opinion is better. Like the tile generator uses add as a default, which I've always found to be kind of clunky. I like this better. What this does is it's going to, the brighter value will always show up over top of the darker value. So it creates this kind of layering effect. We talk about this a ton. Like if you want to look at a blend mode, we have a YouTube video for blend mode specifically, where we go over them all. But generally, max is what you want here. You will more often than not have it on max. You can use add sub too. I rarely do. I almost, it's very rare for me to find an instance where I want this. It's almost always max. So that works. You can change the color random, right? So some of these will become darker, some will become brighter. You'll use this all of the time. This is really important if you want to have like variable heights on whatever you're scattering around. This is extremely useful. You'll use it all the time. The real fun thing down here is this color parametrization mode. So you can use some sort of thing to drive the attributes of the color. So let's use our star, for example. And we're going to need to scale this down a bit because it's really big. And I think we have some symmetry random on. There you go. So we'll go down to the color parameterization mode, we can switch this to scale if we want and turn that multiplier up. Doesn't do anything. What this is doing is linking the scale of these stars to their color. Now, because they're all the same size, nothing has changed. But if we go up to scale random now, the smaller the star is, the darker it gets. So this is really good too. Where this is important, we'll get to it, is usually if you have a bigger, let's say the Pebbles, right? If we're scattering these on a height map, the bigger the pebble is, the taller it should probably be. And the smaller the pebble is, the shorter it should be. So in this way, we can achieve that very easily, because the smaller a pebble gets in X and Y, the shorter it gets in terms of height, because it's getting darker. So you'll do this all of the time. This specific setting, you'll use like a scale random, or you can use a texture to do it, right? You can use a scale map input. Instead of using scale random, use a scale map multiplier. And the smaller they get, the darker they'll be. So this is something you will use a ton of the time, right? Controlling the color via a different attribute, in this case, scale. You can also switch it to row index. So this just says, hey, I'm going to go and turn the scale randoms off completely. The row index is saying, hey, the further down, the further row you are down, the darker you'll get, right? So these earlier rows are much darker than the later rows. You can also switch it to column index, so it does the same thing but in columns. The earlier you are in the columns, the darker you are. The further away you are as a column, the brighter you are. And you can switch it to pattern index, which is a combination of both. I did this earlier when I was comparing the generator to the tile sampler. Right, so this also works really, really well. This is just the patterns gradually get brighter the higher their ID, until you have the brightest one in the bottom right corner. Or you can use color input, which allows you to plug in a texture and use the texture to define where it should be bright and where it should be dark. So just like our other textures, just like rotation map, just like scale map, we can use a texture to drive that value. You'll use this a lot as well too. If you want things to be dark, and if you're talking about a height map shorter, you can put them in a specific area. If you want them to be taller, you can do the same thing. Then you just have global opacity. This just makes them all lower opacity. Or you can use the background color. If you want the background color they're on to be something other than black, you're almost never doing that. Like you kind of almost always leave this at 0, but I can imagine a scenario where you might. The last thing that's worth noting is this final value. You can change this to reverse the rendering order. So instead of them being 0 here and 1 at the bottom, it goes the other direction. It's very rare I've had to do this, but it has happened. So that's everything on the tile sampler kind of note here, all the different parameters and how you control them. The big thing to take away from this, right, again, is that it's very similar to the tile generator, except instead of relying on just a random scale or just a random position, we can use textures to drive those attributes so that they're different in different areas. That's the long and short of it. That's really important to understand. And it gives you a lot more options. There's basically a lot of things that the tile generator can't do that the tile sampler can. And there's not much that the tile generator can do that the tile sampler cannot. The one other thing we talked about it not being able to do by default, which we would probably like it to be able to do, even that we can fix, right? We talked about how we don't have control for the individual X and Y offsets on the tile sampler, but we showed you, we talked about how you can build that back anyway, right? And there's another thing you can do that with as well. If we switch these both to squares and we turn all of our special stuff off, so in fact, I'll just go make a brand new tile sampler and a tile generator. One thing that's useful on the tile generator is down here in the tile generator's color section, you have this checker mask, which is really nice to just turn off every other pattern. That can be really helpful The tile sampler doesn't have that. But a fun workaround you can do is just go up to pattern input, and instead of inputting, right, if we plug in a square, it's just a big white, everything is white, right? But if we put it to pattern input 2, but leave pattern input 2 blank, don't put anything in it, we can go down to the way the distribution works and set it to pattern number and add a 0.5 offset, or sorry, a 1 offset. This is our checker mask, right? Because we're just not plugging anything in. So it's just going, cool, plug in the square, then plug in nothing, plug in the square, plug in nothing. So even this, you can make using the tile sampler. We just have to think about it in a slightly different way. So let's now take all of that stuff we learned about the tile samplers and apply them to an actual material, just to kind of test them all out, and we can really see like the power of these versus just ordinary tile generation, why this is so much better. So I've built a really simple graph here that just makes basically a little piece of terrain, a little terrain field here. It's just some crystals being directionally warped. That's mostly it. Right now, there's very little going on here. I'm blurring the tips just a little bit, but it's very self-explanatory. It's mostly just a crystal that's been directionally warped. Not much to it. What we want to do here, we're going to add a bunch of stuff to this. The first thing I want to do is create basically erosion so that we have these kind of long streaks running up the sides of the mountains, which would ordinarily be very hard to do. Tile generation helps. Tile sampling makes it really easy. So what we'll do here in between these things is get a tile sampler, and we're going to make kind of a scooped shape. So I'm going to grab, as if this has just kind of been weather beaten, right, by like years of, being blasted by sand or whatever. I'm also going to turn our tessellation up a bunch so you have more geometry. This would work even if you were making like terrain in here if you wanted. In fact, there's a material I'm working on that will be Patreon. Well, it'll be on YouTube too, but I'm making like a board game material and I need to erode some mountains, and this has been very helpful. So I'm going to make a parabola and then blend over a gradient. Just multiply it over top. And the idea there is we're just creating it darker scoop at the bottom, brighter scoop at the top. I'll just auto level this. Perfect. I'm going to plug this guy in, and then go our tile sampler. Now that we're using these instead of the generators, feels much better. When I was making that tile generator video and I had to avoid tile sampling, I felt like I had a hand behind my back for sure. This is much better. So we can do a lot of fun stuff here. I'm going to start by just subtracting this over top of the terrain, just so we can see. Right, obviously this is really intense. This is okay. We have a lot of work here to make this more interesting. For one thing, I want these kind of long, thin slopes, or like long, thin chunks coming out of it, because we want erosion. Stuff is eroding down the sides of the mountain. So what I'm going to do is make these taller than they are wide. So I'm going to go up to the size and make this like size of 2 maybe, and make them narrower. So that's good. I like that kind of chunky look. What we want though is we want these to flow. Right now they're all just going one direction. Now we could use rotation random, but this doesn't look that great. Right? You can see that it's just kind of, everything's like randomly stacked on each other. It doesn't feel natural. We would like these erosion lines. We probably want way more of them. So we'll turn this way up. We'll do, I hate using non-power of 2 numbers, so we'll make this 32 by 32. There's no reason for that, by the way. Again, you'll never catch me saying there's a magical number, but it's just a habit, I guess. So we would rather these be oriented along the slopes of these hills. And we know we can do that now. We just need to supply it with directions, vectors. And if we apply just a normal map of this, these are our vectors. right? The strength, it doesn't matter a ton because you'll be able to change the strength on the node as well, but I'm just picking 20 to make it really visible for you guys. There's no magical number here. But this is the normal map is a bunch of different orientations. So as an example, if we had a tile sampler, right? I can actually hop to the end here for a sec. Let's grab one of our arrows. This is just to show off how this works. We plug this in, and we plug our normal map into the vector map multiplier. We go to pattern input, so we're using our arrows. And let's use a lot more of these, like 32 by 32. If we turn in rotation, if we turn the vector map multiplier up, this is really slick. What I'm going to do here quickly is blend on this pink color where those arrows are. So you can see, I'm also going to turn this subtraction down so we don't have those chunks missing. You'll be able to see that our arrows will orient along the direction of the normal. So they're taking their cues on where to go based on the normal map. So these go down that slope, these go down that slope, these are going up because they're coming up from the bottom. But this gives you an orientation for your normals, which is really, really cool, right? So they'll actually have more of a, so we can actually do the same thing where we make them wider than they are tall. And you can see that it's basically a flow map telling the shapes to orient along the normal map. So here's a great example. Down the slope, down the other side of the slope. So this will be really, really helpful for us to get those erosions following the right direction, which is great. So we will skip the pink arrows for now. We don't really need them. And instead what we'll do is go add our subtract erosion back again, which looks really bad. But we're going to turn up. We're going to need a normal map first of our terrain. We'll make this really bright. Again, there's no real reason for me to make it this strong. I'm just doing it so you can see. And then I'm going to turn the vector map multiplier on the rotation up. So now they orient along the normal, which will feel a lot more natural. The thing you'll have to be aware of here is we'll need to apply a 90-degree rotation to these as well. Because in our arrow example, the arrow was looking to the right. And so they aligned properly with the slopes. If we apply a 90-degree rotation to these, just a solid 90 degree, they no longer flow parallel with the slopes of the normal map. They flow perpendicular to them. Right, so this is also useful. Like in some cases, you might want this, the arrows to ride along the edges instead of going up and down the slopes. Our arrow is pointed to the right. So it worked originally without that 90-degree rotation. This guy is pointed to the top. So he's currently riding along the slopes. We need to rotate these by 90 degrees so they ride up and down the slopes instead of along them. So let's just go to the rotation and rotate this 90 degrees. And now they flow up and down the slopes, which is much preferred. And then we can do stuff like scale these up a bit. And we probably don't want as many of them, to be honest. So something like that. And now we'll have these actually ride up and down the slopes, which creates this really cool illusion effect, or erosion effect rather. Right, where you have these like kind of long shapes peeling away at it, which looks really, really cool. We also probably want we can use some other map inputs here. What if we want the effect to be stronger at the tops of the mountains than they are at the bottom? So one thing I'm going to do as well is just go to our scale and not make them so different in X and Y. So they'd be a bit more similar. Let's just make these the same for now. As you can see them kind of oriented up and down the slope, which is great. Turn the rotation random off. Go up to our size, and maybe I do want them to be a little bit taller than they are wide. There you go. So you can see how they run up and down the slope there, or up here. What if we want that effect to be less strong? Let me scale them up a bit more. Maybe we do want a bit more of them, actually, now that I'm looking at it. What if we want, yeah, see, this stuff looks really cool. What if we wanted the effect of this erosion to be less strong the further down it is, right? So maybe the erosion is much stronger at the tops. We can change their color value so that they're darker at the bottoms of our height map. So if I just take the height map and put it into color map input, I can go down to color and switch the color parameterization mode to color input, which is by default, to be honest, and then turn this up. This will make the shapes that show up at the bottom of the slopes much darker, and the shapes that show up at the top of the slopes a lot brighter. So the effect of that erosion is much stronger on the tops of the rocks than it is on the bottom, which is a really cool effect. And again, not doable with a tile generator, right? You want the tile sampler in order to control these values specifically. And I think these are probably a little too long than they are short. So we can just change that a little bit. They're a little too long. We'll scale them up a bit. That's cool. The other thing you'll notice is at the tops of the peaks, right? They're kind of overshooting their target, right? If we look at the height map, they go over here and they kind of cross over. So we could have them get shorter the further up the peak they get, right? So they don't stretch out as much. So what I'll do is actually return these to be 1 by 1. So they're not different in Y than they are in X. And we can use the height map of our cliff to drive the scale of the erosion parabolas so that they are longer down here and much shorter at the top. So we can just plug this into scale map multiplier as well, right? So we're using a lot of these different textures to drive our different effects, right? We have our height map controlling our scale map and our color map, and we have our normal map driving the vector. So we can go down to scale, and now we want to use the scale map multiplier. And what you'll see is the ones that are further down get shorter, and the ones that are, they get smaller, and the ones that are closer up to the tops of the mountains are bigger. We would like them, we want it to only affect the X size, right? So the further they get down there, the narrower they become. And then they get more round the further up you go. We probably also want to invert the height map so that the scale works the other direction. We want them longer at the bottom and more circular at the top. And then we can turn the scale up. But this works. Oh, I inverted the color map by accident. We wanted to invert just the scale. There you go. Go scale map multiplier. Actually, no, we don't want it inverted. We want this. That's fine. Then we're going to turn the scale up. And we may add a little bit of, let's affect just Y. Or we do, you know, we might want both X and Y potentially. And then we'll scale these up just a little bit. so that they're a little bit longer than they are tall. And this starts to feel a lot better. And you know, maybe we do want to affect just X. There you go. That's cool. We can turn this up a bit. And that ends up looking really neat. We get this like really kind of cool erosion effect that's going to have a very different characteristic at the top here, where they're not so narrow than they are at the bottom. Like they're much more narrow down here. Right, so there's a couple ways, and we can add some stuff. Like you would probably want to add a bit of just total scale random on top, like I mentioned in that first part of the first half. Right, so there you go. The ones at the base are way more narrow and skinny than their ones at the top. So you can create these really cool erosion effects. And like I was mentioning, right, like often when you are using the scale map multipliers, the color randoms, you're going to stack a little bit of the random on it as well. So we are controlling the color with the height map so that they're darker down here, brighter up at the tops. But we probably want to add a little bit of random as well, just to vary it up a bit more. Feels more natural. But I think this is really neat. We may even want to add a little bit of rotation random, a tiny bit. But I think that's really cool. And I might go to the color parameterization and turn that up even more, make it less strong in the cracks. And probably scale this up even more just to close the gap between these shapes. There you go. So there's a really kind of cool erosion effect, right? That'd be very, very hard to do with just ordinary tile generation. And I think that's really convincing looking. You get all these nice little plane changes. It's definitely they're all oriented with the surface, right? So they stretch along the long sides of these planes, and they're less effective at the bottom than they are at the top, where they're really kind of beating it up in a big way, where they'd be more susceptible to erosion, right, at the tops of those peaks. So this is very, very sweet. I think this looks cool. I'm not only going to subtract this, I'm also going to use a multi-directional warp. Oops. Multi-directional warp. Oops, that's not the wrong one. There you go. This is just I'm going to use that same erosion texture here, just to not only subtract it from the original texture, but also warp it a little. And this will have to be really, really weak. We don't want it to be super strong here. But this just adds more breakup to the texture, but a tiny bit. Cool. And this is optional. I just want to do that to make sure that looks pretty good. So there's our kind of first terrain that I think looks pretty neat. We can also use, and it's probably a little intense, the subtraction here. You can tone that down a little, and you can fiddle with this as much as you'd like later. But I think it's pretty good for now. That generates us this really cool eroded cliff texture, made possible by tile samplers. Very cool. Up here, I've just made some quick color nodes to color this a bit. I was looking at a bunch of like cool red desert rock that I thought was really interesting looking. So we can plug these in. This is just a gradient map, because I know I just wanted a dark color, bright color, and a slightly brighter one at the top. And then I have an AO color, just mixing in some shadow. Really simple stuff, right? There's not a lot to this. But I think that works really well. I think I'm going to turn my directional warp down a little bit. And there's like, I don't want to do a ton of adjusting in here because this is stuff I'll do later off stream just to make sure that we're in the right spot here. And maybe I will just change the characteristics of this a little. Make these not as stretched as they are. There you go. Yeah, I like that better. Cool. So now that we have kind of our cliff base, what if we add some rocks that have like fallen down into the cracks? So there's no real reason for our pebbles to be at the top. They should be in the bottom. Very easy to do with tile sampling. So we're going to use those cool rock, like pebble generators we had earlier. These guys. So let's just start with a single pebble. We'll find one we like. Something like this one's good. So we're going to scatter these around with a tile sampler. So we're going to put these in. We're going to go to image input because we don't want to be putting that square everywhere. We want to be putting this kind of fun custom pebble shape we built. I'm going to scale these up a little by default just to see how they look, but we're going to make a bunch of adjustments. So let's just blend these on right away. So we're going to use a max blending mode. And this will become all of our new heights. So obviously this is crazy. They're really, really tall. So I'm going to go to a level here and just turn down how bright these are, so it's not so strong. And in fact, what I might do first is just turn the max down a little, which isn't as helpful. We should probably just use this. We'll turn this down. The difficulty I'm having, right, is as I'm making all the pebbles darker, they're getting kind of cut off at certain areas because the max blending mode we're using here, which we want to use, only the brighter of the two values is allowed to come through. And most of the mountain is brighter than the rocks are, obviously, right? So we get these kind of intersections, which are fine, potentially. But what if we had them be what if we told them to grab what color they should be from the terrain? So the rocks that are up here will be brighter and the rocks down here will be darker. That would allow us to place them more, like right now they're kind of just cut off. They can't go up a certain level. But if we take that same height map and we make that drive the color, you'll see, I'll ignore the level for now. And we'll drive these pebbles colors based on the texture that's beneath them. So we'll go down to our color random and make sure that our color parameterization mode is on color input because we're inputting a map texture here. We're going to put that up. And now you see that they take their color commands, how bright they should be, from the texture below them. So they can still show up here because they're fairly bright up here relative to the ones that are down here. So this is just an easier way of placing these, in my opinion, because their height will be relative to the texture that's beneath them. It's almost like kind of laying them on it. Like if you lay a blanket over a bunch of stuff on your bed, like you have a bunch of, in my case, dog toys everywhere, and you put a bed on it or put a blanket on it, they kind of flow over top of all the toys, which is how this works. So I think this works a little bit better. And we should probably add some variety to these pebbles. So let's add some symmetry random. Remember that this is really helpful for just getting more variety out of one shape, because they'll all be, some will be flipped horizontally, some will be flipped vertically, which works really well. Same thing with rotation random. Just apply some 90-degree rotations to them all. As well, I'm going to apply just a little bit of scale random and a little bit of position random, not a ton. So this already just feels a lot better for sure. And then we will go, probably don't want to touch color random yet because we're using this to control it, which is kind of generally more effective. But this works fairly well. I think at this point, we definitely want to, one thing I might want to do is be able to add a control to make this slope less intense. So I'm going to open up this graph that I made earlier off stream, the rock generator. And the slope gets laid on right here. So I'm just going to make a control to make this more or less strong. So you can make a level here, put that here. And the control I'm interested in is making this less strong. So I'm going to go take this and make this value exposed to the parameter. And that's the level out low. So we'll call this pebble roundness. We've done a lot of stuff on Patreon where we've talked about, and in the Discord, where people are talking about how you expose parameters and stuff like this. This isn't that important for the video necessarily. But if you're interested in this kind of thing, there's a lot of content on the Patreon about it, and there's more coming. We're going to do a video all on exposing parameters some point soon. Maybe we'll even use this graph as an example. but I just want to be able to change the pebble roundness from outside of this graph so that there's not as much of a slope, for instance, on these ones. There you go. That's good. They're a little tall, so I'm just going to make them all darker so that they don't get so tall in the texture, but that's better. So let's just color these rocks differently for a second so that we're able to see them separately from the texture a bit simpler. So whenever you're trying to extract, we've done a lot of videos on this as well. Whenever you're trying to extract a mask from this, you're usually doing the same thing. You're taking the version where they're combined and you're subtracting from it the version where they aren't combined. And this will give you the difference between the two, which in this case is like what's different between this and what came before it is the rocks. So if we subtract them, we're left with the rocks. So I can histogram scan this. And this will give us our mask of where our rocks are. We did a whole video on this called like height map extracting. This is worth checking out, but it essentially is that trick. And I'm going to use it to blend on this kind of slightly different gray kind of brown tone. And we'll call this a rock mask. So I made a little portal node there. I hit Alt to make this, and I'm going to name that whatever I want. And then if I have another dot node anywhere in the graph, I can now select that. And that's just so that I don't have the wires running all over the place. Like this. And that's just to color them a little differently. Just so we're able to see them a bit better. And I might make them like a bit brighter, a bit less saturated. I might make them a bit of a cooler color as well, just so they stand out a bit more. They are getting hit with an AO after the fact. That's kind of mixing everything together again, which is fine. I want that. But I think this color even needs to be a little bit cooler. And probably even a bit brighter. You can change this value as much as you want, but I just want you to be able to see the rocks very separately from the terrain. So that works well. We want to change these rocks a lot though. For one thing, maybe we only want them to show up in the cracks. One thing we can do is use our vector displacement to move all the rocks more towards the cracks. So very similarly here, we could take a normal map of our height texture, right, of our rocks, like our rock terrain, or cliffs or whatever, and use this as our vector map input. And if we go down to the position and turn on the vector map displacement, it's going to move the rocks more towards the cracks generally. So you can't go too far on this just because it's eventually going to start, because they're just going in a set direction. And I mean, this already looks much better, but the problem is if one was over here, it's just going to keep going along that direction until eventually it's going up the other side, right? So for example, this one is probably just going this way. But if I put the number high enough, it just keeps going in that direction. So eventually, if this is high enough, it's still not useful. But a little bit of this is really nice to try to bunch them all together into the cracks, because you can see all these ones are moving down their slopes to meet in the middle here. So a little bit, I think, is really nice to sort of push them away from the peaks and into the cracks. It feels a lot more natural now that this is the way those rocks could have actually worked, right? It's really cool. The other thing I'm going to do is actually use a mask map to turn them off in the event that they do get too high up the rocks. So for that, we would want to use our height map again. So this will go into mask map, and we'll go up here and turn this up. Right now, it's actually turning them off in the cracks. We want the reverse. We want them to turn off on the peaks, right? So you can see them here. Let's look at the blend while we're changing this. If I go back to the tile sampler and turn the mask map up, you'll see that I'm actually taking them away from the cracks. But we know we have this handy invert here. If we turn this on, we're just going to turn them off on the cliffs. right? So we're only allowing them to be really low down in the height map to ensure we don't have any that are kind of sneaking in up really tall. This will just take some of those out. And just like our other mask-driven inputs, we probably stack a little bit of mask random on it too, just to make it feel a little bit more natural. And this, I think this feels quite good. I think this feels really reasonable. And again, this is something that would not easily, or sometimes at all, be achievable in a tile generator, right? The tile sampler makes these kind of more complicated interactions between the different elements possible. From here, what I might do is, instead of having just the one pebble, and I'm not crazy about this pebble shape, to be honest. Let's find one that's a bit more interesting. That one's kind of cool. Might turn the roundness on this one down a little bit. Just looking for like a really interesting one that I like. I'm not looking for anything in specific, really, just one that I like the look of. This is fine. So we can have more of them, though. So let's find a second one we like. That one's kind of different. And I'm going to turn the pattern input up and put another one. So now we have 2 types of rock out. You can make another, and we're going to put, I mean, we can put as many as we want, really. 6 is the technical limit on this, but we can go higher. My tile sampler that I built has, my tile sampler custom one has a lot. I think it's, or this isn't, I don't know where my custom one is. My tile generator custom definitely has way more. I forget how many I added, but it's a lot. Yeah, I have up to 24 on mine. So you can add more, and maybe we'll make a video about that, about going in and modifying existing graphs. But in the meantime, we're just going to go through and get a couple more versions. Let's just get 2 more. So just trying to find an interesting shape. I like that. That's cool. And this just gives us more variety, right? People don't see the same shape as often, which makes it, I want to try to avoid really unique looking shapes because they tend to stand out more. But I think this works really well. We get like a nice variety of them. So this is neat, and it gives us, like, I think, like I said, a much more natural looking result to the way the rocks are laid out along our texture. Now, we could make even, what you'll often see in nature, right, is you'll see, like, I do this a lot when I'm talking about the aquariums, when I'm building them. You'll have like a big rock, and then around that big rock, you'll have a bunch of medium rocks. And then around that medium rock and big rock, you have a bunch of even smaller rocks. Like there's this sort of hierarchy, right? A big rock, medium rocks, small rocks, dirt. And that's true of anything. Plants too. You have, like, if you look at the edge of a forest, right, you have a big tree, and there's small trees around it, and then bushes, and then small plants, and then grass. Like there's this hierarchy. So we could use a second tile sampler here to scatter small rocks around where the big rocks are. And we can take advantage of some of our other, existing tile sampler knowledge to make that look really, really cool and natural. So I'm going to make another one, tile sampler grayscale. We're going to go to image put. We'll add whatever, the 4 of these, and we'll grab the ones we want. So input 1, input 2, input 3, input 4. And for these ones, we're going to need a lot more because they're going to be a lot smaller. So let's go up to like 32 by 32. We may even go more. We might go like 48, 48. Whoa, not 478. 48 by 48. So that's decent. These ones are going to be quite small. We can scale them up a bit. And for the mask map of this one, we're actually going to use where the big rocks were, because we only want them to show up near the big rocks. So I'm going to auto level where our stones are. I'm going to blur them. And this is basically going to create like a radius where they can start showing up. And I'm going to auto level this again. and plug this into our mask map. And when we turn this up, the mask map now, the pebbles are only going to show up in a certain radius around these ones. So here I'm just going to blend these two together. And we'll probably want to control the heights of the small rocks independently. So I'll make them really tiny. And we'll blend our big rock with our small rock. I'm using a max blending mode, and you'll see the pebbles only show up near the big rocks. And if we want to expand that radius, you can blur this texture more to expand out where they can be, which is really nice. We get this kind of safe radius around them. We probably want these to change their height based on the terrain underneath them again. So we need our height map in the color map. And we'll go down to color map and make sure our color input, our color parameterization mode is set to color input. Turn this up. And so they're taking their orders for how big they should be. And I obviously need to brighten them up quite a bit. But they take their height information, how tall they should be, from the texture beneath them. I'm also going to go, add some symmetry random, rotation random. Right, but this already feels pretty cool that we have this sort of hierarchy of them. I might make these a little bit shorter. And then something else we can do, we could push them away from the big rocks or gather them towards it potentially. We'll try both. But I want a bit of position random first of all, so they don't look like they're on a grid. I think that's much better. We could also have them be bigger the closer they are to the big rocks and smaller the further away they get. So we could use this as a scale map as well. So if we plug this into scale map, basically the pebbles that are further out will shrink. And the pebbles that are closer to where the rocks originally were will stay big. And this will be a huge impact. This will look really nice. So we turn this up a bunch. And we'll probably need to turn the starting scale up to compensate. But you can see we get these big rocks much closer to the original big rocks. And then the further away you get, the more the smaller those pebbles will be. So you create that kind of effect that I was talking about, where you have this kind of fall off from big rocks to small rocks. We can make these even bigger. But this looks really cool. It adds a really kind of, and it might add a bit of random on top of it too. But this can add a really neat effect, right? It feels really nice and natural. And again, this would be really hard to do with Tile Generator, right? So I'm hoping everyone's kind of seeing the potential here. The last thing I wanted to do is add some kind of like dry grass to this graph. I'm not really crazy about this stone. I think it's this vertical one. It is. So I'm going to swap this one out for a different one. That's better. Okay. Hopefully everyone is kind of like seeing like, and hopefully it's getting your head kind of thinking about what you can use this on. It's not just for things like that. You could use this if you were trying to scatter bolts on metal, if you were trying to, the erosion's a good example. If you wanted to put leaves on a vine, this is also very useful. There's all sorts of really cool things you can do with this, but hopefully this is giving you an idea. I think some grass would be nice too. And to look at some, I think we made quite some decent grass. Recently we did I had a patron submit a graph to me that they wanted some feedback on, and we made a video of it where we made a bunch of grass. And a lot of what we're about to do is in that video too. So if you want to check that one out, that'll probably be helpful to get kind of a more complete material version of what we're doing. But I've made these kind of quick grass blades. And we're going to use a tile sampler to spread these all around. So when you go here, go to image input, we're going to get a lot of these. going to start with like 96, but we're probably going to need more. I'm going to scale them up quite a bit. And I want these grass blades, just like our rocks, they should take their height value from the height of the terrain underneath them. Right? That makes sense. So what we'll do here is same thing. We need to grab our rock height. So maybe we'll make a dot node for this. We'll call it rock height, just so we can access it over here. We need to grab our rock height. We're going to plug that into color map. And we're going to change the color of all these blades based on that color map. So in the darker parts of the cliff, they'll get darker, and on the higher parts, they'll be brighter. You can already kind of see the cliff under it, which is really cool. And then I'm going to add some position random for sure. And I'm just going to blend this on top right away. And we'll make our mask so we can color them kind of a fun, probably yellowy green. There you go. So there's some grass blades. They're going to fill in the cracks here mostly. So these are still probably too tall. So we'll go here. I kind of want to boost up them showing up further. So I'm going to scale the whites here so that this texture is more bright. And then I'm going to take the overall height of the grass blades and drop it down. I may even use a lower max value here. They should only really show up in the cracks here. Just fine. This is kind of like, I feel like the grass blades should grow mostly because maybe they're sheltered. You need to look at reference, but I'm imagining they're kind of like sheltered from the wind down here a bit. So they grow more likely in the cracks. So they grow up a little bit further. I might turn the max down a bit. Sure, that's kind of neat. And then we can add some, right now they're all rotated the same direction, which feels a little odd. If we want them to look flowy, we could take something like a Gaussian noise, and instead of using the vector map rotation, we'll just use the rotation map input, which we used before. This will apply a rotation to them based on that rotation map. And the nice thing about this is the blades all rotate, like we said, a very similar value to a blade next to them. And as a result, we have this nice effect where it looks like they're kind of being swept along with each other. So it's different from using the vector map, right? But it creates a different effect. But both are good. They're just for different things, right? I think I like this because we have the blades flowing kind of as if, you have wind across these dunes and they're kind of being swept in a specific direction. I think that can work really nice. I'm also going to add some scale random to these blades. Not much. Maybe scale them up a little bit too. And then maybe some color random, but we'll see later. But this is a very cool looking texture, right? This is just fun to look at, these guys. But we need a mask too of where our blades are. So again, we just need to take what we have now, our blades being added, and then take what we had before. We had the blades and subtract them. And if we histogram scan this, we'll have a nice mask for our blades. So this is where our blades are. And we could make another dot node for this and call this grass mask. And we'll put this up here. We want to make sure that the grass blades happen after the stone, but before the AO, because the AO will help kind of merge everything together. I think these grass blades will need to be fairly low saturation and more of a kind of yellow-green, like a dry. It should be almost brown. But we'll make a dot node, grab our grass mask, plug this in. Cool. And obviously the blades are, I think it's still, it's a little too like mint green. You would want these maybe a bit more saturated, maybe a bit more towards yellow. Almost more of like a brown, really. Too saturated though. So you can play with this to get the color of those blades. I think you don't want, people will make this, I don't think you want this. This is like grass from a different dimension. You would want it to blend in a little bit more. And you could make this way more interesting later. You could have like different blade color. We're not really doing that in this tutorial. We're mostly just trying to find a nice solid color for them. I think that works pretty well. But this is just another example of a way you can add in another detail and where tile samplers can really help get you more out of it. We could also add a little bit of vector map rotation to these blades so that they can follow the normal a little as well. So if we have our rock height, we can, and that's just the rock, this is just the height of our terrain essentially. Put this up. We can add a little bit of vector rotation to this as well. So we'll go down to the rotation, add a little bit of vector map multiplier, and this is just so that they follow the normal a little bit, as well as that random, that flow. It just feels a little bit better. You probably don't need a ton of it, very little. Cool. And maybe we can have a bit more of it. And you can play with that forever. But that's good for now. I'm hoping that just gives people a bunch of ideas and gets you cooking. The tile sampler is really, really strong. You can do all sorts of really, really fun stuff with it. So I'm hoping you have a bit of a better understanding now. And all right, that's tile samplers. So I hope everyone, can understand that real big core difference between the two types of generator there, the generator or the sampler, is the ability for those mask maps to drive all those different effects. And like I mentioned, it's not the case that you will always want those, but you often do. So I'm actually in the habit of often just whenever I want tile generation, using a tile sampler anyway. And if I decide later I want additional functionality, I'm happy to just plug in those textures and go instead of having to rebuild it from a tile generator. If I know for sure I'm never going to use any of those things, then I'll just start with a tile generator. But it's definitely much more powerful. It's a bit more expensive, which we didn't talk about a ton in this video. We're going to do a video at some point. I think it was voted on the Patreon actually. So we're having a video coming soon that talks all about graph optimization and stuff like that. So if you don't need it, yeah, use the tile generator, but often you'll be using the sampler because it's just so much more powerful, right? We were able to create that really cool erosion effect, put those rocks exactly where we want them, orient stuff the way we like. That stuff is all super, super important and really, really valuable. If you liked the video, you picked something up that you thought was interesting, I'd appreciate you liking the video if you liked it. Subscribe if you haven't, so that you can turn on that notification bell, so that when new videos come out, you're able to get that notification. I still have people showing up to the videos that are like, oh, I didn't know you're back making stuff, which is funny because I've been at it for about 4 or 5 months. So turning that on, I think will help just so that you can see stuff when it comes out. As well, like I mentioned, if you're interested in longer tutorials where we go do complete material builds, kind of, really specific things, there's a ton of stuff on the Patreon. There's more coming as we kind of generate new stuff. But right now there's, several, I think 3 8-hour long tutorials to go through. So there's a lot of stuff on there and I think it's worth it. If you'd like to support the channel, I would appreciate the follow over there. That'd be really appreciated. There's also a Discord and people are in that Discord sharing their work and trying to all work together to improve and ask questions about the tutorial content. And that's been really cool too. So if you're interested in all that, you can hop over to Patreon. The link's in the description. It's also on the YouTube landing page if you're interested. But other than that, I appreciate you guys sticking around for this one. I don't know what the next Know the Node will be. I'll probably put it up to a vote, but I suspect it will be splatter circulars, which is another type of tile generation. But for now, I think this one is really strong, really, really useful, and I hope it's got all your kind of creative juices bubbling and you're ready to go make some fun stuff. So we'll see you in the next one.